35-year-old Judy Moylanen checked one more time that her 3-year-old daughter was safely buckled into her car seat, and then, with a sigh of relief, Judy climbed into the passenger seat of the van and nodded to her husband Bruce, who was at the wheel, letting him know that they were now ready to go. The car engine was already on, and the inside of the vehicle was nice and warm, and in another minute, they had backed down the driveway of their neat brick ranch house directly onto US Route 41. It was Thanksgiving Day, November 26th, 1992, and even now, hours before they would sit down to the traditional turkey dinner and prayer of gratitude, Judy was already feeling a little unaccustomed rush of happiness as she and Bruce headed west along 41 towards Judy's parents' house where they would spend the holiday weekend. Just 2 days ago, Judy had wondered if this trip would even be possible. Here, in Michigan's remote Upper Peninsula, Thanksgiving is almost overshadowed by the state's 2-week-long deer hunting season that spans the last 2 weeks of November. It's a time when the biggest fashion trend is blaze orange, and even visitors to the little town of Harvey, where the Moylanens lived, were more likely to ask each other, "Did you get your buck yet?" than they were to just wave and say hello. And on the first day of hunting season, Bruce had managed to bring home a male deer with a good-sized rack of antlers. But on the drive back to their house, after he was finished hunting, Bruce had hit another deer that was crossing the road, and that collision had totaled the Moylanens' Subaru station wagon. And it wasn't until the day just before Thanksgiving that the couple had been able to find and place a down payment on a replacement vehicle large enough to carry all of their luggage, as well as their 4 dogs. Unlike Judy's job as an assistant hospital administrator at nearby Marquette General Hospital, Bruce's side gig as a dog trainer meant that the family required a car that could accommodate several dog crates as well as 3 passengers. And the tan Chevrolet van was definitely comfortable as well as roomy. Within just a few minutes of starting their 2.5-hour drive, Elise had already dropped off to sleep. And with Bruce focused on how their new vehicle handled, Judy had a rare opportunity to just sit there and let her mind wander. Day to day, Judy's work was very demanding and she put in long hours. Even coupled with his dog training business and freelance work as an insurance claim adjuster, Bruce's main job as an instrument technician for Marquette General Hospital did not bring in as much money as Judy's regular paycheck. Not that Judy looked or acted the part of the traditional family breadwinner. Compared to her husband, who was 6 feet tall, broad-shouldered, and 180 pounds, Judy was just 5 foot 4 inches tall, with short, curly, light brown hair, and a quiet but practical manner. But behind Judy's oversized glasses, her eyes sparkled when she smiled. And she smiled a lot, just as she was quick to laugh at other people's jokes. And although Judy never sought out the social spotlight, in fact, that kind of attention would have just made her feel uncomfortable, her ability to listen and respond in ways that made others around her shine meant that people just really loved Judy and liked being around her. And there had always been more to Judy than met the eye. She adored her parents and her 2 brothers, and she was looking forward to spending the upcoming weekend chatting comfortably inside the snug family home with her mom and sister-in-law while Elise played with her cousins. But, like her younger brothers, Judy was also an outdoors person. Ever since she could walk, the woods in the back of her parents' home had been Judy's playground. And growing up in Ontonagon, with a population of just 2,000 people and a business district that did not have one single stoplight, there had been plenty of woods as well as fields and streams to explore. And so during that time, Judy had become very comfortable outdoors. She had also become skilled at handling firearms. So, in addition to enjoying plenty of time in the kitchen and in front of the fireplace, Judy was also looking forward to getting out in the forest with Bruce and her dad and brothers to do some hunting of their own. Hunting wasn't the only outdoor sport that Judy was really good at. She was also an excellent skier. In fact, it was that passion that had brought her and Bruce together back in 1974 when Judy was 17 and Bruce, who lived in a town even smaller than Ontonagon, was 20. But good as Judy was on skis, Bruce was even better. And at Porcupine Mountain, located right on the edge of Lake Superior, Bruce's ability and job with the ski patrol conferred a lot of status on a young man whose mother had barely scraped up the money to put food on the table for their 4 children, and whose father spent a lot of time at the local bars. So, at first glance, Judy and Bruce had been an unlikely couple. Overcoming his difficult childhood, Bruce had grown into a cocky and outgoing young man who never hesitated to speak his mind. Judy, on the other hand, came from a deeply religious, deeply conservative family whose morals and religious beliefs she shared. Her parents, Dale and Marianne Blake, had been high school sweethearts whose first child, Judy, had been born when Marianne was 21. Together, and for the last 40 years, the Blakes had owned and operated their own small automobile and oil business called Dale's Service. And as the Blake family grew with the arrival of Judy's two brothers, Marianne had supplemented their income with her job at First National Bank in Ontonagon, and then with the job she held now at Lake Superior Credit Union. But when it came to Judy's social life, even without her parents' tendency to be overprotective of their only daughter, Judy herself preferred reading and arts and crafts to parties and dating, just as she would have chosen a good piece of pie and a cold glass of milk over a bottle of beer and a bowl of peanuts. But when Judy and Bruce both wound up attending Northern Michigan University in Marquette at the same time, the attraction between them was irresistible. And on June 24th, 1978, 4 years after meeting on the slopes of Porcupine Mountain, Bruce and Judy were married. Afterward, the couple stayed in Michigan's Upper Peninsula, but they moved 120 miles east to Harvey. Once there, Judy established her career at the nearby Marquette General Hospital. Bruce, who started out in healthcare as an emergency medical technician, eventually took the instrument technician job at Marquette General Hospital. Along the way, Bruce had established North County Claims Service, a small independent insurance business, and Big Creek Kennels. And 11 years after exchanging their wedding vows, the couple had added to the ranks of the Blake and Moylannon families with the birth of their first and so far only child, Elise, now napping soundly in the back seat of the 1987 Chevrolet van. Just the thought of her daughter always made Judy smile. And ever since Judy had suffered a serious concussion in a freak accident the year before, she had been reminded all over again about the importance of family and friends. She knew how happy her own parents would be to have their adult children, plus all 6 grandchildren, together under one roof for this holiday weekend. Not to mention the added excitement of 4 extra dogs, all Springer Spaniels, just like her parents' dog, Streak. But even as Judy looked forward to the Blake family reunion and good food that now lay just 2 hours ahead of them in a hometown that she had always loved, she could not entirely ignore that sense of dread that had become so familiar to her. And it was just not a feeling that she had been able to share with her family or with Bruce. He was handy around the house, great about taking care of Elise when Judy's workdays stretched to 12 hours, and he was also a better cook than she was. But discussing and exploring their innermost thoughts was not one of his strengths. Looking over at her husband now, his big familiar hands firmly on the wheel, Judy reminded herself that this was not the time to worry. This was the time for her and Bruce to relax, take stock of their lives and blessings, and spend time together over the long weekend. And sure enough, after Thursday's wonderful Thanksgiving celebration, Judy and Bruce were able to put in 2 full days of hunting together, while Elise enjoyed the attention of her grandmother and Marianne's own mother, Elise's great-grandmother Nemi. So on Friday, while Judy's brothers headed for their deer camp about 16 miles south, Bruce and Judy decided to try their luck at a hunting spot even further away. But at Dishnot Creek, their attempts to drive deer out of cover were unsuccessful, and so were the hours they spent sitting quietly in small camouflage shacks called blinds. So by late afternoon, Judy was ready to call it a day. The falling darkness and the sound of howling coyotes suddenly made her wish she was back at home instead of growing stiff with cold in these unfamiliar woods. But even as she stepped out of her blind to call out to Bruce, from behind her there was the sound of a gunshot. Down a small hill and across the creek in front of her, Bruce was so alarmed by the sudden noise he practically leapt out of his blind, hoping it was Judy who had fired at a deer. Instead, he saw his wife approaching through the dark, just carrying her flashlight, not her rifle. The shot had been so close to where Judy was standing that the whole episode shook both of them. It was a reminder of just how dangerous hunters could be, not just to the wildlife, but to other hunters. After that, Judy and Bruce abandoned their blinds and headed back to their van. The next morning, which was Saturday, the couple felt much better, and so Bruce and Judy did not need any persuading to go hunting again. But this time, they decided to go with other family members rather than striking out on their own again. Especially with hunting season about to close, everyone knew there were bound to be some hunters out in the woods who were going to be shooting at anything just to get that last buck. And by the time Judy woke up on Sunday morning, her only regret of the weekend was that her 4-day holiday was just hours from being over. She and Bruce had both come back empty-handed from hunting the day before, but better that, Judy thought, than just wounding a deer. That's what had happened to her cousin Mike, who had asked Bruce to get up early that morning and go back into the woods to see if they could find this wounded deer and put it out of its misery. As for Judy, while Bruce was out hunting, dropping in on some friends, and running errands before their return trip that evening back to Harvey, Judy was content to stay home with her sisters-in-law, her mom, and Grandma Nemi. After her mother had served up their traditional post-Thanksgiving lunch of turkey casserole, Judy was also glad to have the chance to give her mom a break. So, after everyone had finished eating, Judy urged her mother to take some time alone in her little office to relax and catch up on some bookkeeping for work, while Judy cleaned up and did the dishes. By about 1:15 p.m., Judy had the kitchen and dining room all squared away. Hanging the dish towel on its usual hook, Judy glanced at her watch and decided that now was a good time for her to take the 5 dogs out for their afternoon walk. Her younger brother, Jerry, and his family, who lived 4 hours away in Wisconsin, were planning to leave on Tanagan by 2:30, so Judy had just about an hour before she needed to be back with the dogs. As Judy pulled on her black down jacket, her parents' dog, Streak, was practically dancing with excitement at the signs that he was about to go outside. But it was the 4 much more obedient Moylanen dogs, kenneled outside, who really needed the exercise. They were the ones with a long night of travel ahead. Judy didn't bother with a leash. This was 1992 and the Upper Peninsula, and dogs were free to run around. A few minutes later, Judy called out a goodbye to her mom and opened the door to step out into the thick woods just beyond the edge of her parents' backyard. As she did, she pulled her coat tighter around herself. Not only was it already below freezing outside, but the air was so damp it felt even colder, and the afternoon clouds completely blocked the sun. An hour later, at 2:15 p.m., Jerry and his wife had their car all packed and ready to go. The only thing they had left to do was to wait for Judy so they could say their final goodbyes before heading home. And that is when the Blakes looked out the back window of the kitchen and saw Streak come running out of the woods, tongue lolling and tail wagging. Except that Streak was all alone. Judy and the other 4 dogs were nowhere to be seen. By 4 p.m., Judy's mother knew there was something wrong. For the past hour and a half, Mary Ann had been telling herself that Streak, who was not nearly as well trained as Judy and Bruce's dogs, must have just decided it was time to go home. And Judy was probably still out in the woods thinking Streak was out there too, lost or just wandering around. But by 4:20, Mary Ann knew she was clutching at straws. There was just no way that Judy would stay out this long walking the dogs or looking for Streak, and no way she would have missed saying goodbye to Jerry and his family. So, with Bruce and Mary Ann's husband and her other son and his family all out of the house, Mary Ann decided to leave little Elise with her great-grandma Nemi and go find Judy herself. And minutes later, Mary Ann was at the door putting on her coat and boots, but Mary Ann's first attempt to find her daughter failed. In fact, when Mary Ann had blown the dog whistle she brought with her, the sight of the 4 dogs running in her direction and still no sign of Judy had only served to turn Mary Ann's sense of worry into outright fear. And by the time she had managed to get the dogs back in their kennels and return to the woods, Mary Ann was on the verge of tears. So she didn't hesitate when her neighbor, Bill Dorvanen, who had seen the older woman picking her way into the woods, offered to help with the search. And grabbing his flashlight, Bill now led the 2 of them deeper into the woods. It was about 5 p.m., and the sun was just 10 minutes away from setting when Bill saw Judy's body. Mary Ann's only daughter was right in front of them, lying across the trail on her left side, her eyes open and blank in the glare of the flashlight. Judy's head was resting on a slight rise, and her feet were partly submerged in a pool of icy water. When Bill carefully turned Judy over onto her back, her arms fell to either side, and a moment later, both Bill and behind him Mary Ann could see that Judy's upper right chest was completely soaked in dark red blood. It didn't take long for the local sheriff's deputy and emergency medical technicians who had responded to Bill's 911 call to confirm what Bill and a hysterical Mary Ann already knew, that Judy was dead. In fact, by the time those first responders had reached the scene at about 5:20 p.m., Judy's body was already showing signs of rigor mortis, a stiffening of her limbs that suggested Judy may have already been dead for as long as 3.5 hours. Before the medics removed Judy's body, Sheriff's Deputy Tom Cusino had done the best he could to gather any evidence of what might have happened to Judy. Even though it looked like a tragic hunting accident, law enforcement would still need to find out exactly what happened and who may have fired the stray bullet that had killed Judy. But even though the deputy had made sure to take plenty of pictures of Judy's body and the surrounding area, all he could really see were scattered leaves and dog prints. And he already knew from talking to the Blake's neighbor that one critical piece of evidence, the original position of the victim's body, had already been compromised when Bill had shifted Judy's body to check for signs of life. Now, after taking Marianne to stay with another neighbor, Bill had rejoined the deputy and told him everything that Marianne had said about why she was out in the woods looking for her daughter in the first place, how Judy's walk with the dogs had lasted far too long, and how Streak had come without Judy. In answer to the deputy's questions, Bill said no, this was not an area where people generally went hunting. It was too populated and too close to the 8 or 9 families, like the Blakes and Dorvanens, that lived right behind the woods on Cherry Lane. Then, together with one of the ambulance drivers, all 3 men used flashlights to search for any sign of the bullet or bullets that had nearly ripped Judy's body in half. It seemed likely that the shot had come from a rifle, a type of gun that ejects its spent shell casings after firing, but after tramping around in the woods in the dark, the search did not turn up either a casing or a bullet. And so, after marking the area for further investigation, by 6 p.m., Deputy Cusino was ready to give the order for Judy's body to be removed from the scene, placed in the ambulance, and transported to the county morgue that was located inside Marquette General Hospital. Deputy Cusino already knew that the 12-person Ontonagon Sheriff's Department, which did not include crime scene techs, would have to get help from the state to investigate Judy's death. And that call for assistance went out to State Police Sergeant Detective Bill Ball at about 6:40 p.m., a little over 5 hours after Judy had left her parents' home to go walk the dogs. After getting the message that a woman had been found dead out and back of Cherry Lane in Ontonagon, 67 miles to the south, the 21-year veteran investigator immediately hopped into his cruiser. And an hour and a quarter later, Detective Ball was standing in the Ontonagon Sheriff's Department, listening intently to Deputy Cusino summarize what law enforcement had found and done so far. Detective Ball had a well-earned reputation for not making assumptions about the cases he worked on, and for being tenacious about gathering the facts he felt he needed before reaching any conclusions. So, after going to view Judy's body in the morgue, the investigator did not immediately agree with the deputy medical examiner's suggestion that, like most shootings in the Upper Peninsula during deer hunting season, this death was accidental. And even if it turned out to be accidental, Detective Ball intended to find out how it had happened and whose bullet had actually killed Judy. So, even though it was now pitch dark, Detective Ball, along with 8 other members of local law enforcement, including the sheriff and Deputy Cusino, headed back into the woods behind the Blake house where Judy's body had been found. And this time, using higher-powered flashlights, the searchers found something that the deputy's earlier search had missed. About 37 feet west of where Judy's body had been found, the sheriff was standing under a maple tree and pointing upwards with his flashlight at a fresh horizontal scar in the tree bark. Looking at that mark, both the sheriff and the detective knew they had just gotten their first potential break in the case. Because if that slash on the tree had been made by the bullet that killed Judy, then maybe they could figure out the bullet's trajectory and find the bullet as well as a spent shell casing that would help them identify what kind of weapon killed Judy. Detective Ball decided to order tracking dogs out at the scene for 9 a.m. the next morning, but in the meantime, at about 10:30 p.m., the detective decided it was time to talk with the grieving family. Deputy Cusino, who had informed the Blakes and Judy's husband at about 5 p.m. that Judy had been killed, now joined the detective, and a few minutes later, the 2 men were walking out of the woods towards the Blakes' home on Cherry Lane. Looking up at the lighted windows of the house in front of him, Detective Ball was already especially interested in one particular person, Judy's husband, Bruce. Because in every case involving the death of a wife or husband, the first suspect is always the spouse. A few minutes later, the investigators were seated at the Blakes' kitchen table. Judy's mother, Mary Ann, had been given a sedative to control her hysteria, so the investigators conducted their initial interview with only 3 family members: Judy's father, Dale, her brother, David, who lived with his family in Ontonagon, and with Bruce. According to Deputy Casino, Bruce had been dumbfounded by the news of his wife's death, and one of his first questions to the deputy had been to ask if his wife had been wearing a blaze orange when she was found in the woods. After being told no, Bruce had leaned his forehead against the hospital wall and gently pounded his fists into its hard surface. Looking now at the stunned faces staring back at him from across the table, Detective Ball kept his questions short and to the point. He was just here to collect first impressions, find out when Judy was last seen, and to find out where each of these people he was speaking to were earlier that afternoon. By the time he left the house a half hour later, Detective Ball knew one thing for sure. Every person at that table appeared to have a solid alibi for the 4.5-hour window between the time Judy left the house to walk the dogs and the time when her body was discovered. On Tuesday, December 1st, one day after the end of Michigan's deer hunting season, and 2 days after Judy's death, one of Michigan's biggest newspapers ran a story with the headline, "Deer Season Gets Safer." In that article, which attributed 4 deaths and 25 injuries to hunting accidents in the 1992 season that had just come to an end, Judy's death was listed as a possible 5th accidental fatality, but one that was currently being investigated by local and state law enforcement. Ontonagon sheriff was quoted in the paper as appealing to anyone with information to please come forward. And 1 day later, on Wednesday, December 2nd, the day of Judy's funeral service in Ontonagon, Detective Ball received a phone call from the police department in Marquette, where Judy lived and worked. An officer there was passing along information from an anonymous caller, information that made Detective Ball decide it was time to head for Marquette to take a closer look into Judy's work life as well as her personal life. In the meantime, local officers were able to pinpoint the likely time of Judy's death to about 2 p.m. That's the time that several residents in the area had each heard a single gunshot coming from the woods behind Cherry Lane on November 29th. Detective Ball also had officers check out other leads, possible criminals who had recently been released from police custody, reports of unidentified or strange people in the area where Judy was found, and reports of anyone in that area who was seen carrying firearms. In addition, assuming now that Judy had been killed at around 2 p.m., Detective Ball ordered officers to double-check every alibi provided to them by Judy's husband, father, brothers, and cousins, along with the alibis of any other family member who was not actually inside of the Blake household when Judy was shot. But it was Detective Ball's decision to call in an Ontonagon civilian to assist in the investigation that would eventually give police their first real breakthrough. Armed with his metal detector, 42-year-old Dan Castle had earned a reputation among Ontonagon law enforcement for being able to recover hard-to-find evidence lost in the Upper Peninsula's dense forests. Now, on Thursday, December 3rd, Dan Castle was standing with Detective Ball and Deputy Casino at the exact place behind Cherry Lane where Judy's body had been discovered. A chemical wash applied to the blaze mark on the maple tree 37 feet away had revealed the presence of lead, a metal that is commonly found in bullets. Now, the man with a passion for finding buried treasure had the difficult, if not impossible, assignment of finding the bullet that had passed through Judy's body and then ricocheted off of that tree 5 days earlier. And while Dan was looking for that bullet, Detective Ball headed for Marquette County, where the Moylanens lived and worked. If Judy's death had not been an accident, the detective needed to find out who might have wanted her dead and why. It didn't take long for the state police investigator to realize that the anonymous caller had been right. Judy's life and Judy's past were much more complicated than Bruce and her family had led them to believe. Judy's co-workers and supervisors at the Marquette General Hospital would soon tell detectives why it had taken almost 2 weeks for the Moylanens to replace the station wagon Bruce had totaled on the first day of hunting season. According to the rumor mill, Judy was facing some serious financial issues, and just scraping together $500 for a down payment on the 5-year-old replacement van had been a big challenge. It would also turn out that Judy had recently contacted several of her creditors to ask about restructuring her loans. And when the bank turned down her application to refinance the couple's mortgage, Judy had mentioned to one of her coworkers that she and Bruce might be facing bankruptcy. But aside from learning about the Moylannons' financial problems, when it came to suspects in what could either be an accident or murder, the investigation seemed to be hitting one dead end after another. None of the reports of other hunters or suspicious people in or near the place where Judy died had turned up any viable leads. As for Judy's husband and other family members, police had not been able to find any hard evidence that would link any of them to Judy's death. Not only had Judy's husband, Bruce, prepared a list of people who could verify his whereabouts on November 29th, he had also willingly signed off on a consent to search form. That form gave police permission to examine and inventory Bruce's collection of firearms, as well as examine Judy's various life insurance policies, the payout from which could have provided a motive for Bruce to kill his wife. It would not be until mid-December that the state police investigator would get a series of tips that, together, would break the case wide open. The first of those tips came from Dan Castle up in Ontonagon. For 9 frustrating days, all Dan had found in the woods behind Cherry Lane were bottle caps and old coins. But on Sunday, December 13th, exactly 2 weeks after Judy was shot, Dan decided that before giving up the search for the bullet, he would try a simple physics experiment to pinpoint exactly where the bullet might have come to Earth. So, trading his metal detector for a slingshot and a pocket full of marbles, Dan stood in the exact location where Judy's body had been found and stooped to what he guessed would have been a point level with Judy's chest, where the bullet likely entered her body. Once in this position, Dan fired marble after marble at the blaze mark on the maple tree, and each time the marble ricocheted off the blaze, he made a careful note of where the marble landed. Once he had a cluster of marbles all in the same general area, Dan pocketed his slingshot and again took up his metal detector. And sure enough, in that area where the marbles had clustered, just 77 feet away from the maple tree and buried under a 2-inch layer of snow, Dan discovered a fresh bullet lying on top of the dead leaves that blanketed the ground. Dan grabbed his radio, and an hour later, Detective Ball was standing in the woods with Dan, both of them looking down at this critical new piece of evidence. And when the Marquette State Police Crime Lab ballistics expert arrived for work the next morning, Detective Ball was there waiting, sealed evidence bag in hand. And before the day was out, Detective Ball had 2 more important pieces of information. Crime tech experts had confirmed the .30 caliber bullet that Dan had recovered had in fact killed Judy. Embedded inside the bullet were not only traces of wood from the maple tree, but also fibers from the jacket and shirt that Judy had been wearing the day she was shot. The analysis also showed that Judy's death was no accident. According to the ballistics expert, the bullet was still rising as it passed through Judy's body before ricocheting off the maple tree, which meant it had been fired not from some great distance away, but at close range, and by someone who had put the sights of their guns squarely on Judy's chest. And by the end of that day, the lab had also provided Detective Ball with a list of guns that could have fired a .30 caliber bullet and left distinctive markings that matched the ones they found on this particular bullet. On the same day that Dan Castle had discovered the bullet that killed Judy, Detective Ball received a final tip from a hospital administrator at Portage Hospital in Hancock, Michigan, about 2 hours north of Marquette General Hospital, where Judy also had a job in hospital administration. 36-year-old Gail Lampinen wanted to talk with police about a person who she claimed had been stalking her and who also might have a connection to Judy's death. 2 weeks later, Detective Ball would hear a similar story about the same stalker from another hospital employee, Judy's good childhood friend, Leanne Wysocki, who was employed as a nurse at Marquette General Hospital. But it wasn't until Gail opened a box of sweaters that this stalker had given her as a gift that the police were able to connect all this information together to finally uncover the identity of the person who killed Judy Moylannon. And what they discovered would become one of the most sensational crime stories to ever come out of Michigan's remote and mysterious Upper Peninsula. Based on Detective Ball's investigation into the information provided by these 2 women, Here is a recreation of what happened to Judy Moylannon on the last day of her life, Sunday afternoon, November 29th, 1992. After spending the morning inside the house, helping her mother prepare the traditional Sunday after Thanksgiving lunch of turkey casserole and then washing up the dishes afterward, Judy was glad for the chance to get outside and take all 5 dogs for a walk in the woods that she loved. Even though Streak was not as well trained as the Moylannon's dogs, Judy figured he would stay with the pack as they walked. And if he didn't, Judy knew there was only one place Streak would go, and that was home to her parents' house. As Judy let her dogs out of their kennels behind the house, she pulled her black down coat a little tighter around her. Even after the scare she and Bruce had when they were out hunting on Friday at Dishnaw Creek, when that bullet from behind them had come so close to where Judy stood near her hunting blind, Judy still hadn't bothered to put on a blaze orange safety vest for this walk with the dogs. Unlike Dishnaw Creek, the woods she now stepped into were too close to the houses on Cherry Lane to attract any hunters. And so, as Judy and the dogs stepped into the woods, the bright pink of her shirt collar was quickly swallowed up among the trees. But to Judy's killer, it wouldn't have mattered if the 35-year-old mother was wearing an entire outfit of blaze orange, because the murderer was not hiding in the woods that afternoon to hunt. The murderer, who was maybe just 50 yards from the path Judy was most likely to follow, was there to kill. And at this distance, hitting Judy was going to be an easy shot. And when it was all over, the murderer was confident that it would look like just another tragic deer hunting accident. Stray bullets had been known to travel so far in these woods that the hunters who fired them would have no idea that they might have struck a human and not a deer. And besides, Judy already appeared to be a very accident-prone person. She had a 5-inch long scar on her head from a concussion that happened a year earlier, and after that, there had been a fire in the Moylannon house that could have done some serious damage if the smell of smoke hadn't caused Judy to wake up and put the fire out. And whatever the risks, once this was done, once the killer had gotten rid of Judy, the killer would then be able to concentrate on 2 other women, Gail Lampinen and Leanne Wysocki. The first time Judy passed by the killer's hideout, the killer only raised their rifle and aimed, placing the sights on Judy's chest, but not pulling the trigger. This trail led to a field where the dogs could run, and then Judy would pass this way again on her way back to her parents' house. Better to wait, so anyone back at the house wouldn't connect the sound of a shot to Judy just having left for her walk. Sure enough, a few minutes after 2 p.m., the killer could hear Judy and the dogs once again approaching the killer's hiding place. This time, when the killer leveled their sights on the side of Judy's chest, they pulled the trigger. The gunshot seemed to echo like a bolt of thunder through the quiet woods, and one of the dogs immediately broke from the pack and ran in the direction of the Blake house on Cherry Lane. Even as the killer ran through the woods to the nearby empty lot where they had parked their vehicle, the killer knew they'd been lucky. Instead of giving chase, the other 4 dogs just stayed right where they were. As the medical examiner's report would later show, the single bullet that killed Judy entered her body just under her right armpit before exiting through her left rear shoulder, ricocheting off the maple tree 37 feet away and landing in the sodden leaves where Dan Castle would discover it 14 days later. On its way through the soft tissues of Judy's chest cavity, the bullet basically tore off the top of Judy's heart. After the bullet had struck and killed Judy, she fell on her side at a right angle to the trail, her head on a slight rise and her feet in a pool of icy water. All 4 of her dogs would stay close to her body for another 2 hours. That's when Judy's mother would also walk into the woods looking for Judy and blow the dog whistle that finally called the dogs home. There was nothing Judy's killer could do to retrieve the bullet they had fired, but the killer had made sure to collect the spent shell casing before leaving the woods. Later, the killer would use a torch to destroy the gun and shell casing before disposing of the weapon in the nearby Ford River. On December 13th, 14 days after Judy's murder, Gail Lampinen decided to open the 5 boxes that had been left on her doorstep the day before. Happily married, Gail had already confided to her husband about the unwanted attention she had been receiving at work, and now apparently at home. But looking down at the pile of cardboard boxes at her feet, Gail was forced to admit that unwanted attention was an understatement. This looked more like the behavior of a full-blown stalker. Taking the first box into her bedroom, Gail opened it and looked inside. Neatly folded and packed, she saw a collection of women's sweaters in various styles and colors, but as Gail took each sweater out of the box, she realized they were not new sweaters. And a moment later, she pulled out a piece of yellow-lined notepaper. It was a letter addressed to her, dated 6 months earlier, and it was signed by Judy Moylannon, a woman, as Gail well knew, who was now dead. Gail had hardly finished reading the note before her hand was on the telephone, and a few minutes later, she was connected to Detective Ball's office, where she left a detailed message for the investigator. The letter may have been signed by Judy Moylannon, but there was no doubt in Gail's mind who the real author was. It was the same man who had left those boxes, the same man who had been sending her suggestive cards and notes, stopping by her office and showing up unannounced at the Lampinen house. It was, in fact, the same man who had been bragging to her just a few days ago that before long he'd be quitting his job as a technician at Marquette General Hospital thanks to a financial windfall that was about to make him a very wealthy man. And when Detective Ball returned to his office and called Gail back, he could practically hear the last few pieces of the puzzle fall into place. It would take months to prove their case, but Detective Ball and his team of investigators now had the bullet, the gun, the motive, and the evidence they needed to bring Bruce Moylannon, Judy's husband and killer, to justice. It would turn out the Moylannons' financial problems could all be traced to Bruce's poor money management, bad business decisions, and potentially fraudulent activity involving his insurance company, North County Claim Service. But Judy had only recently become aware of just how bad their money situation was. It was only when the couple's application to refinance their home was turned down that Judy had called the bank and realized that because of Bruce's money mismanagement, the family was facing possible bankruptcy and legal action. And, as Judy confided to a close friend, over the following weeks, Judy was learning more and more things about Bruce that made her scared and unhappy. Meanwhile, when Judy confronted Bruce about their precarious financial situation, Bruce became convinced that Judy would divorce him and take half of all of his assets. To Bruce, a much better option was to kill his wife and make it look like an accident. And while Bruce had insisted to police that the payout on Judy's insurance policies could hardly amount to more than $40,000, when police had searched Bruce's house in mid-December, they realized he was lying. While no single insurance policy on Judy was worth a fortune, Bruce had made sure he had taken out multiple policies on his wife. Hidden in an attic crawl space in the Moylannon house, Detective Ball had found a whole packet of those policies. And in the event of an accidental death, when the payout doubled, like a deer hunting fatality, when you added all the policies together, Bruce stood to walk away from Judy's death with a total of more than $300,000, an amount that would be worth $637,000 in 2022. The Moylannons' paperwork also revealed that in addition to a financial motive for wanting Judy dead, Bruce did in fact own a rifle that could have fired the fatal bullet that Dan Castle recovered. Listed as one of Bruce's assets on a loan application was a Remington 300 Savage, one of the weapons that the state crime lab said could have caused the distinctive riflings on the bullet that killed Judy. As for Bruce's alibi, he lied about that too. And once police interviewed every person on Bruce's list, they realized Bruce could not account for where he was between 1:45 and 2:45 on the afternoon that Judy was killed. But even though recent financial problems may have pushed Bruce and Judy to the breaking point, serious problems in the marriage had shown up at least 2 years earlier. That's when Bruce met Gail Lampinen at Portage Hospital when he was making a delivery there. Known throughout the hospitals in the area as an aggressive and awkward flirt, Bruce seemed to have fallen especially hard for Gail, even though she and her husband did their best to discourage Bruce from visiting and calling Gail. And once Judy was dead, Bruce launched an all-out romantic assault on Gail, one so obvious it prompted that first anonymous tip to police in Marquette, in which the caller reported that Bruce was stalking a hospital employee. As for the letter Gail had found, enclosed with the boxes of sweaters Bruce had dropped off at the Lampinen house, Bruce, writing as Judy, told Gail that the couple had grown apart and would soon be getting a divorce, and that Bruce would need Gail's help in finding a new partner, a woman exactly like Gail herself. But even without the handwriting analysis that confirmed Bruce was the author of the so-called sweater letter, it was the postscript at the end of the note that convinced Gail that Bruce had written the letter as a way of speaking directly to her. Quote, P.S. Don't tell the prospects, but believe it or not, Bruce is incredible in the sack. Not that Gail was the only target of Bruce's unwanted advances. The day after Judy's funeral, Bruce also started hitting on Judy's best childhood friend, Leanne Wysocki, a nurse at Marquette General Hospital, even going so far as to suggest that she might want to move in with him and 3-year-old Elise. And as Leanne reported to Detective Ball in late December, Bruce had told Leanne details about the shooting that had not been made public and that only Judy's killer would know, like exactly how the bullet had entered Judy's body just when her arm was swinging back, and how it was the perfect timing of that shot that resulted in the massive internal injuries that killed his wife. It would also turn out that Bruce may have made 2 earlier attempts on Judy's life. Back in 1991, so a year before Judy was killed, he apparently pushed an 85-pound chimney block off the roof of their house onto Judy's head. If the block had not glanced off of her head, Judy likely would have died rather than sustaining a severe concussion that put her in the hospital for 3 days with no memory of what had happened to her and a 5-inch gash on her scalp. A few months after that, Judy woke up one morning and found the house full of smoke. It would turn out that before leaving to go hunting, while Judy and Elise were still both asleep, Bruce had dropped live embers from the wood stove onto a pile of dry firewood in the basement. But despite the growing mountain of circumstantial evidence against him, it wasn't until Bruce failed a lie detector test and police showed him a copy of the sweater letter that he had written to Gail that Judy's husband finally confessed to killing his wife. On April 23, 1993, 5 months after Judy's death, Bruce told investigators, and later Judy's own brother David, that Bruce just couldn't take it anymore and suddenly went nuts. He told Detective Ball that in addition to threatening him with divorce, Judy had been a tyrant whose long workdays forced Bruce to do more than his fair share of the cooking and childcare. As for the timing of Judy's murder, Bruce said that it was just a lucky guess that Judy would go out that afternoon to walk the dogs. He said that the first time Judy had passed him on the path in the woods, that he just couldn't bring himself to shoot her. And then on her return trip, he said he aimed the rifle once and then lowered it and then raised it one more time, closed his eyes, and pulled the trigger. On December 15, 1993, Bruce Moylanen was convicted of premeditated first-degree murder. He would later be sentenced to life in prison without parole. The only time Bruce showed any emotion during his trial was when Gail Lampinen took the stand to testify against him, at which point Bruce began to sob uncontrollably. Judy's brother, David Blake, and his wife, Yvonne, adopted and raised the Moylanens' little girl, Elise. Judy's mother, Marianne Blake, died at the age of 71 on November 29, 2007, exactly 15 years to the day that her only daughter was murdered. In 1982, a very outdoorsy teenage girl and boy who had recently started dating decided to go camping in Maine. Around 1 a.m. on the first night they were there, the girl wakes up because she has to go to the bathroom, and she's about to unzip her tent when she stops because she hears some strange noises coming from outside their tent. It wasn't that loud, but it sounded distinctly like something was digging in the ground. But she really had to go, and she figured, you know what, it's probably just some small animal or something. And so she begins to unzip the tent, and there's a little bit of moonlight that night, and there was a clearing outside of their tent. So the moonlight's pouring through, so she has plenty of illumination. And so she looks through this tiny hole, and she can't believe what she sees. It is a grown woman squatting down about 2 or 3 feet away from their tent. Her back is to them, so she can't see that she's looking through the tent. And she's feverishly digging into the ground in front of her. The girl literally falls backwards into her tent. She's so startled by what she sees, and she lands on her boyfriend, who immediately gets up and he's like, "What's going on?" And she goes, "Shh." And she points at the little hole where she had unzipped the tent, and she goes, "Look." The boy is confused, but he can tell his girlfriend is very serious, so he sits up quietly and he looks through the little opening in the door and he sees the digging woman. The boy recoils and looks at his girlfriend and he's like, "What is going on out there?" He takes a flashlight and she's telling him, "Don't do it." And he opens up the tent a little bit more and he aims his flashlight directly on this woman. And this gets her attention and she stops digging and she stands up slowly and she turns around and faces them and she's got no expression. She's not giving them any indication why she's there. She's not acting aggressive. She's not acting scared. She's just completely neutral. And she stands there staring at them for quite a while before turning around and just walking away from their campsite. And after a little while, when they were pretty certain she was gone, they open their tent all the way, they go outside, they kind of scan around with their flashlights and she's nowhere to be found, and they go to where she was digging, and it's just this weird 4-inch deep hole in the ground. There's no rhyme or reason to why she was doing that. And so after sitting there wondering what they should do, they settled on, well, tomorrow we'll tell the park rangers that she was here and maybe they'll do something about it. And so feeling pretty confident that this woman's not going to come back, they both go back into the tent, they zip it shut, they get in their sleeping bags, and they're about to go to sleep when they hear someone running towards their campsite. And they know it's this woman. They immediately unzip the tent and they look out, and now the woman's not digging anymore. She's rummaging through some of their stuff that's outside of their tent. And the way she's doing it, they described as monkey-like. She'd pick something up, look at it, and throw it over her head. She'd pick the next thing up, throw it over her head, back and forth, just throwing things behind her. And so the boy gets out and he shines a light on her and goes, "You need to leave." And she doesn't react. She just keeps flipping through all their stuff until he gets pretty forceful and says, "You need to leave right now." And at that point, she kind of stops and looks at him like, "What are you doing here?" And then she gets up, turns around, and walks away. Now the couple really doesn't know what to do because she's clearly willing to come back after being confronted. But they stayed outside their tent for about 15 more minutes, shining their light and making lots of noise and treating her like she's an animal. And they're just trying to scare her away from the campsite. And after a little bit of time, they thought, okay, there's no way she comes back now because, we were pretty aggressive with her this time and she seemed to really get it. They both do go back in the tent, and as soon as they zip it shut, they hear her come running straight back to the site, like she was literally waiting in the wings for when they went back in the tent. And this time she runs back to the hole in the ground and she's just feverishly digging into the ground as fast as she can. And this time they come out of their tent and they're mad and they are screaming at this woman to get the F out of here. What are you doing? And this seems to kind of frighten the woman, who gets up and she looks at them like, "Why are you yelling at me?" And she runs away, and it looked almost animalistic the way she was running away, like she was feral. The boy and the girl are totally shaken up at this point. It's about 1:30 in the morning and this woman just keeps coming back to their site and they don't know what to do about it. So they turn on some lanterns and they turn on their flashlights and they decide, we're just going to stay outside until the morning. That way we know she doesn't come back and doesn't steal anything from us. But by about 3:30 in the morning, they've been outside for 2 hours. They're getting cold. They're super tired. The woman's nowhere to be found. And so they finally say, "You want to go back in and get some sleep? I think this time she's really gone." They get back in their sleeping bags and they go to sleep. They don't hear her again. The next morning when they get up and they unzip their tent, they look outside and all of their stuff has been thrown all over the campsite. And the hole in the ground that the woman had dug that was previously about 4 or 6 inches deep is now well over a foot deep. And they realize this woman must have been lurking in the shadows in the woods, watching them from 1:30 to 3:30 in the morning. That whole time they were out there kind of warding her off. She was just waiting, just watching them the whole time in the shadows. And as soon as they went into their tent, she must have given it a little bit of time, but then she ran right back over and she ransacked their site. But the strangest thing was, after they looked through all of the stuff she had chucked around, nothing was missing, and there was some pretty expensive stuff that was laying out that she could have taken but didn't. After they picked up their site, they went to the park ranger and they told them about what had happened, but the ranger has no idea what to make of it. He's never heard of such a thing. And so the couple just leaves that day because they're not about to spend another night here. And to this day, they have no idea why this woman was running onto their site and digging into the ground and rummaging through their stuff. It was like she was just a wild animal. In 2004, wildland firefighters were called into a forest in central Idaho to combat an emerging fire. By the time the crew arrived at this forest, it was clear this fire was spreading a lot faster than they anticipated. As a result, Mike, who was the assistant superintendent, basically the second in command of this particular crew, he said he was going to hop on the ATV and drive off way ahead of them to see if they needed to spread out farther to stop this fire. So Mike hops on an ATV and he takes off down this ancient-looking logging road that probably hasn't seen a vehicle or a person in decades. Mike had made it about a half mile down this trail when he noticed out of the corner of his eye a bobcat was running perpendicular to him straight out of the forest as if it was going to cross the road about 100 feet in front of him. Mike comes to a stop and thinks, this bobcat doesn't know I'm here. It probably is not used to seeing people. It's going to come out into this trail, see me, get spooked, and run away. But instead, this bobcat runs directly into the middle of the road, turns, and faces Mike in a very aggressive posture. Mike is shocked at what he's seeing because he knows bobcats are notoriously elusive and they're nocturnal. So for this thing to be out in the daytime and to be intentionally blocking his path and standing there aggressively like it's going to attack him was so out of the ordinary. So the two of them are just looking at each other, not moving for about 10 seconds until this bobcat opens its mouth and then begins screaming like a person. It did not seem like the right sound for what he was looking at. He said more than scary, it was just intensely weird. And just as quickly as this bobcat has arrived, it stops screaming, turns and runs to a tree, sprints up the tree and climbs onto this branch that happens to be perched right over the trail he's on. And Mike's looking up at this bobcat that's right over this trail, and he knows if I'm going to continue going down this trail, I have to go under this screaming bobcat. Although totally freaked out, he knew he needed to keep going down this trail, and he's thinking to himself, you know what, this bobcat is probably just scared of me, and that was its reaction, as bizarre as it was. And so he throws his ATV in gear, and he starts slowly moving down the trail, the whole time keeping his eye on the bobcat, making sure it doesn't show any sign like it's going to leap off onto him. And as he got closer and closer, he just gunned it and sped underneath the branch, and luckily it didn't jump down on him. And as he got a little bit farther away, he turned up to look, and the bobcat had turned around and was still watching him very intently sitting on this branch. Mike makes it about another half mile down the road before he sees something else that's very strange. He sees a cabin. It's this little tiny cabin that's tucked away in the woods, and he's thinking to himself, I'm on federal land. There aren't supposed to be any private structures here. And he figures, even if this is illegal, I do need to stop and make sure no one's in there because there's this huge fire coming this way. And so he parks his ATV and he starts walking off the trail towards this cabin. And as he gets closer, he can tell it's not only a very old cabin, but it's almost certainly abandoned because he can see all these slats that have been put over all of the windows, like it's been boarded up. But when he got up close, he noticed something strange. The door itself into this cabin was not boarded up, and the doorknob was missing, and in its place was this shiny silver chain link that was thread through the opening where there should have been a doorknob around a wooden post that was right outside the door. Basically a makeshift lock because there was no doorknob to it. And he's thinking how weird it is that in the middle of this forest, on an old ancient logging road that clearly no one goes down, where bobcats are running around freely, that there would be this new chain here, which indicates someone must have been here recently. And so he bends down to look through the space that was still there from where the doorknob should have been, and he looks inside and he can't really see anything. And so he takes his flashlight and he shines it in, and he can't believe what he's looking at. There's all this furniture inside this tiny little cabin in the middle of nowhere, and it's all upside down. And he's just totally creeped out. So he puts his flashlight away and kind of backs up, and he starts walking back towards the road, and he can't help it, but the whole time he's looking over his shoulder back at the cabin, like someone's gonna emerge from outside of this cabin. He gets to the road, and by the time he's there, he's running. He jumps on his ATV, he whips it around, and he starts blazing back up the logging road back towards his crew. And when he turns the corner to where that bobcat was, he sees there is now a Native American woman standing in the middle of the path. She's wearing this tattered white nightgown, she's barefoot, and she's standing in the same spot he saw that bobcat. And she's looking at him as if she's expecting him, like she's been tipped off that he's gonna be here. And he stops about 100 feet away from her, and now he's officially freaked out. He's still looking over his shoulder towards that cabin because now everything is just totally weird to him. And before he has a chance to do anything, this woman lets out a scream, a blood-curdling scream that is identical to the bobcat's scream. And so Mike is totally unnerved by this. Everything about this day has really gone sideways as this woman is screaming at the top of her lungs, and then suddenly she stops. Mike's still just standing there like, what's going on? And she runs to the same tree the bobcat had climbed earlier, and she climbs up this tree and gets onto the branch where the bobcat was and perches like an animal on the branch looking at Mike. And now, just like the bobcat, Mike is going to have to drive right underneath this woman who is perched over the trail. And so he throws his ATV in gear and he starts driving and he's staring at this woman, and now her mouth is just open like she's about to scream again. And as soon as he got close, he gunned it and went right underneath her. And he turned around after he got some distance away from her, and she's still on the branch, now turned around facing him as he drives away. He goes back, he tells the crew what he saw, and as much as they all want to go back and see this woman and see this cabin, they know they can't. They got to fight this fire. And so ultimately they do that and then they leave. A couple of days later, Mike was in a bar in the town right near the forest they had just been in fighting that fire, and Mike had seen the woman in the cabin, and he struck up a conversation with a local. And he said, hey, do you know of any buildings that are in that section of the forest? And the guy kind of laughed and he was like, the only building I ever heard of out there was apparently some cabin where some crazy lady thought of herself as a witch, and she apparently had a bobcat for a pet. And so we as kids were just told to stay away from there. So besides that, I don't know. In 2015, an experienced outdoorsman named Bob, along with his wife, his young daughter, and their 2 German shepherds, decided to go camping in a remote part of northern Oregon. When they arrived at the site, Bob began setting up the big family tent for everyone to sleep in, and his daughter said, hey, do you mind if I sleep in the spare 2-man tent that we always bring with us? Bob and his wife deliberated for a minute, but said, you know what, that's fine, but you gotta bring Guts. That's one of the German shepherds. Guts needs to sleep with you because he's gonna be your protection. So that night, after some s'mores around a campfire, Bob's daughter, along with Guts, retreat to their 2-man tent, and Bob, his wife, and Leah, the other dog, retreat to their tent. That night, Bob wakes up suddenly to what sounds like footsteps outside of his tent, and he looks to his side, and his wife is still in the tent with him, and so is Leah, the other dog, and he listens really closely, and he can hear his daughter is snoring, and he can hear the sound of Guts breathing. So his whole family is accounted for, but he still hears these footsteps, and they don't sound like light little scampering sounds like you might expect from a squirrel or some small critter. They sound heavy, like a big creature is roaming around their campsite. But Bob's dogs are really keyed in to protecting their family, and since Guts and Leah are not up going crazy about whatever's out there, he figures, you know what, it's gotta be an elk or something, and it's not gonna do anything to us, so Bob ultimately just goes back to sleep. The next morning, Bob gets up, and everybody's just fine. There's no sign of any intruders in their campsite, and so that only confirms to him that, yep, it was just some harmless animal kind of walking around the wilderness, because we're in a pretty remote area. That morning, they decide to go for a walk down the road that was right next to their campsite. And so they take the dogs, they start walking, and they make it a couple hundred feet down this road when all of a sudden Guts sees something or hears something and takes off sprinting down the road and turns down this little access road that branches off of the road they're on into the woods. And Bob is thinking, oh no, there's a campsite down there and this big German shepherd's gonna bound up on them and something bad's gonna happen. And so Bob, his heart's racing, he starts taking off after Guts. He goes down the access road and he finds Guts stopped right outside of a campsite. But there doesn't appear to be anybody in the campsite. But there's a tent, there's a cooler, there's a table, there's all the things you would expect at a campsite, just no people. So Bob runs up and he grabs Guts and he yells out reflexively, hey, I'm really sorry, he's totally harmless, I don't know what he saw, hey, we're leaving. But then before he leaves, he realizes on the tent there's this big scratch through it, like it's been cut open. And curiosity gets the better of him, and so he kind of walks up, keeping an eye out in case he's wrong and there are people still here. But as he gets closer, he realizes there's definitely no one here. This site is abandoned, because he's looking around and all of their stuff has just been ransacked. There's scratch marks on everything, like animals have clearly come through here. And Bob, who is an avid outdoorsman, he knows how much some of their equipment cost. And he's thinking, why would anyone abandon this really expensive tent or this really expensive cooler? And as he's thinking about that, he turns and he sees there's a propane tank, a solid metal propane tank that has been completely flattened. But there's no tree that's fallen nearby. There's no source. There's no way that could have been flattened. So he's definitely unsettled by this, but ultimately he decides, you know what? I'm going to take my family, go back to my campsite. I'll just call the park rangers. They can come down here and they can figure out what this is. Later that afternoon, Bob and his family are back at their campsite just a couple hundred feet away from this abandoned campsite. And at one point, his wife gets up to go use the bathroom. She walks about 70 feet away behind a tree and she squats down. And then all of a sudden, she gets up and starts running back towards camp. And Bob sees this. He turns and sees her running towards him. At the same time, Guts gets up and starts sprinting towards her. And so Bob's thinking, what the heck is going on? Bob turns to his daughter and says, stay right here with Leah. And Bob gets up and starts running towards his wife. And Guts at this point has run to his wife and past his wife. Guts has run way into the woods. And as Bob is running up to his wife, he's like, what's going on? Why are you running? What's going on? And she says, I don't know. I just had this horrible feeling someone was watching me. And when I turned, I already saw Guts running towards me and it scared me. And so that's why I'm here. And he's like, look, go with our daughter and with Leah. I'm going to see what's going on. And so his wife leaves and Bob draws his pistol and he starts walking out towards where Guts has now stopped. Hair raised, growling, it's yapping and barking at something in front of it. And Bob's looking and he can't see anything. And finally, after not being able to figure out what the heck is going on, he just takes Guts and goes back to his campsite. When Bob got back to his campsite, he wanted to leave. And his wife wanted to leave. His daughter didn't really know what was going on, but the attitude was, we want to leave. However, it was getting late and they had a bunch of stuff they would need to pack up. And it was going to be a real ordeal trying to do that, especially without any light. So they decide, okay, we'll stay one more day and we're going to leave first thing in the morning. In Bob's head, he's thinking, okay, I heard weird footsteps outside. We have this abandoned campsite nearby that's been thrashed up in the flattened propane tank. And now my wife is running away from something and Guts is seeing strange things in the woods. Like there's a lot of weird stuff going on. And he decides he's going to set up a tripwire all the way around his campsite using a rope tied at about 8 inches off the ground, where along the rope would be little pieces of metal that would clang together. So if anything touched the rope, it would make the metallic clinking sound, then it would alert Bob that someone's here. And so Bob goes over to the edge of the site where there's an obvious starting point for this tripwire, and he bends down to tie the rope, and he realizes, oh my God, someone's already done this. There is another tripwire that's already been built around the outside of our campsite. It's just been cut, it's been broken. Like it doesn't work, but it's here. Someone else who was at this campsite felt concerned enough about whatever was in the woods that they already had this idea. Bob didn't even tie his perimeter. He just drew his gun, told his family, get in the truck, and he stayed up all night protecting his family in the truck. As soon as the sun came up, they packed up and they got the heck out of there. Bob is convinced that there is something out there in the woods in northern Oregon that was walking around their campsite at night, that's scaring their dogs, that's stalking them basically and watching them from a distance. And probably whatever is out in the woods is the same thing that caused the previous group to set up their own tripwire. And it's also probably the reason the other campers at the other campsite were willing to abandon their nice equipment to get the heck out of there, because they are not messing with whatever the heck is out in those woods. So that's going to do it, guys. Let me know in the comments what you thought of today's stories, and I will pin the best comment at the top of the comments section. If you enjoyed today's story and you haven't done this already, please invite the like button to come out to dinner with you at a very expensive restaurant. Eat a ton of food, but before the bill gets there, say you're going to the bathroom and just leave the restaurant. Also, please subscribe to this channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username for both platforms is the same. It's just JohnBallen416. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok where my username is MrBallen. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called MrBallen. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, some combination, just know that I really appreciate your support. And until next time, that's going to do it. See you.
Gel derdini bana anlat. Bulunur bir çözüm elbet. Bulunur bir çözüm elbet. Ben de yollardan geçtim. Karanlıklar içindeydim. Ben de sulardan içtim. Gecelerden karşı çıktım. Gecenin bir sabahı Olur elbet yatanı, her gecenin bir sabahı, bulunur elbet yatanı. Sen hiç üzülme yavrum, ben çok düştüm de kalktım.
As many of you may know, the biggest event ever to come out of Ballen Studios is fast approaching. From September 26th to October 20th, I will be on tour. I'll be visiting 15 cities across the United States, telling strange, dark, and mysterious stories live and in person. Last year, we did one show. It was a sold-out show in Austin, Texas, to kind of trial run this concept, and it's basically just me on stage telling stories, and people loved it, and there was huge demand for more, and so here we are, doing 15 more shows. Tickets for these 15 shows have been selling very quickly, but there are still tickets available if you act basically right now. All you have to do is go to tour.ballenstudios.com, find the show that is, nearest you or whichever one you're interested in, click on the link, and if there are tickets still available, you can buy them through that link. And if you're lucky, there might even be some VIP tickets left, which will give you access to meet this guy, if that's of interest to you. Also, just for our VIP ticket holders, bring your copy of our graphic novel and I'll sign it for you when we meet. And so the way you get the book is either you have already pre-ordered it or you can buy a copy at the theater. We'll be selling them on site. Again, I'm going to be on tour from September 26th to October 20th, telling stories in person. It's going to be great. If you want to go, there are still tickets, but they're going quick. Just go to tour.ballenstudios.com and get your tickets today. Okay, back to the stories. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. If you got something out of this episode and you haven't done this already, please offer to house sit for the Amazon Music follow button. But when you get there, just prop all their doors and windows open and leave. This podcast airs every Monday and Thursday morning, but in the meantime, you can always watch one of the hundreds of stories we have posted on our main YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen. Consider donating to our charity. It's called the MrBallen Foundation, and it provides support to victims of violent crime as well as their families. Monthly donors to the MrBallen Foundation Honor Them Society will receive free gifts and exclusive invites to special live events. Go to mrballen.foundation and click Get Involved to join the Honor Them Society today. If you want to get in touch with me, please follow me on any major social media platform and then send me a direct message. My username is just @MrBallen, and I really do read the majority of my DMs. Lastly, we have some really cool merchandise, so head on over to shopmrballen.com to have a look. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. I want to create a mildly effective... I want to make a mildly effective cold medicine made exclusively out of Egyptian fire ants. Take its horn off its head and you beat it to death. Sing out! Die. You die. Turned and leapt head first out the glass window. Pow! Yes! Got up on its flippers and began chasing us down the cave. A nice hot maga musk. And we settled on a piping hot plate of eagle tonsils, your smoked chicken gallbladder eggnog, your zebra cornea souffle. Get to go surfing. Surfing. But it no! Pow! Yes, it did.
Papa, tu dois avoir.
Papa, tu dois avoir. Lungy was already in there, and he looks at me and he says, Papaye, deberíamos ter ficado con Hello Fresh. Oh, Lungy, put on... Ooh, MrBallen, ooh. It's not even funny. If you're wondering why I just shared a whole slew of me just butchering my various intros and different parts of strange, dark, and mysterious videos, well, it's because you all asked for it. Last month, in our first ever MrBallen newsletter, we posed a question. We said, what do you want me to share with you the most? And overwhelmingly, what you all wanted to see was a compilation of bloopers. And you don't want to miss the next newsletter because maybe there's something else you want to see, and that newsletter might give you a chance to actually see that thing happening. And also, remember, the newsletter encompasses basically everything we're up to, both things that are coming up in the future, things that you might have missed, what we're doing now. And it's designed to be really easy to consume. It's very visual. It's not all text. Like, it's very beautiful. It's an incredibly good newsletter. And so to sign up, all you got to do is go to ballenstudios.com and input your email, and boom, you're signed up. Also, you can just click the link in the description below. That will also get you signed up for the newsletter. And then we will deliver it to you, once a month, and boom, there you go. You're in the know. So thank you to all the people who have already signed up. And in advance, thank you so much to those that are about to go sign up. And I'm sorry to those that plan to not sign up, because really, you're missing out. And you know what? Seagull Lung, he's going to be pretty disappointed in you. So there's that too. Okay, peer pressure. Go get it done. ballenstudios.com. Sign up for our incredible monthly newsletter. Thank you so much. See ya. Wait, don't go anywhere. If you're looking for more strange, dark, and mysterious videos, click here.